Hello and welcome back to another Piskie Bite. Miniature episodes where we explore the folklore, history and legends from across Devon and Cornwall. It's our first episode of 2024 and it's good to be back. Hope you're all keeping well and having a good start to the year. Once again, a big thank you to everyone who's been listening and for all your support. And also to those of you who've been messaging to offer your lovely feedback as well. That means a lot, and I really appreciate that. If you're enjoying these little Piskie Bites or the full-length Piskie Trap episodes, then do feel free to get in touch. You can reach me at thepiskietrap@gmail.com. If you're enjoying the series, give us a like and subscribe. Share around with your friends and family. All of that really helps to spread the word and to help keep this project growing. You can find the Piskie Trap on Instagram and on Facebook as well. Instagram is probably where I'm most active these days, so that's probably the easiest. And if you're able to and you'd like to help support the project further, then you can check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/thepiskietrap. And basically that support helps me to keep the lights on here and to source research materials and things to put this content together. Anyway, that's enough of that. Let's crack on with the episode. I thought we'd look at something a bit different this time. Returning to the topic of the local ghost story, I wanted to look at a little selection of stories and articles that have cropped up in my research over the past few weeks, and I thought I'd share those with you. Some of them are a bit random, a bit weird. Some of them are quite amusing in their own way as well. And all of them, with the exception of one, have come from articles that I've found in the local newspapers. So, here's a few local ghost stories from across Cornwall. Our first story featured in Totnes Weekly Times on the 28th of September, 1907, and reads as follows. A true ghost story has been forwarded to the Daily Chronicle by its Truro correspondent. An old woman, he says, residing in a village near Truro, recently died. She had long been looked upon as the possessor of supernatural powers, and she had repeatedly intimated to her acquaintances that she would return to earth after her demise. A son of the old lady went to reside in his mother's house following her death. He and his young wife had not occupied the house long, however, before they found their nights were disturbed by strange and apparently unearthly noises. This went on for some time, until eventually the young couple decided to give up the house and the small farm adjoining and remove to a house near at hand. Then, a neighbour suggested to them that if a child could be brought into the house, the noise would cease. Having no children of their own, they decided to adopt a little girl. Strange to say, from the time of the little girl's adoption, the noises have completely ceased, and they have been troubled no further. So, an interesting little story there, and it cropped up in a few newspapers around that time. And it's pretty vague as well. We're not given any names or any specific details about which village it may have been. And then there's this whole thing about them seemingly adopting a little girl in order to banish the ghost from their house. All a bit weird, really. It makes you wonder if this is one of those local tales that's kind of been passed around the district by word of mouth over the years. Our next story is equally weird and comes from an article written by one John Harris in The Cornishman, dated the 5th of September 1878, entitled A True Cornish Ghost Story. And it reads, The following singular incident occurred about 30 years ago when I was an underground worker in the mine at Dolcoath, Camborne. My son Fred and I had finished our work one night in the mine and then climbed the ladders to the surface, reaching the top shaft as nearly as could be midnight. We had to take off our underground apparel and to put on our wearing clothes, which were hanging to iron pins in the blacksmith's shop. The little smithy shed was dark and silent now, and there was no work done in it except during the day. This shed stood alone, having but one forge, one stack, and one door opening in halves in the front. Here was a carriage road, just wide enough to take a cart, which went on by the end of the shop until it diverged into another and a wider one. Behind the smithy were huge heaps of rough rubbish and refuse stones, which had been drawn up from the interior of the mine and thrown there as useless, entirely barring and blocking up the place, rising even against the wall of the house. It was difficult indeed for a man to cross the place on foot, while for a horse and rider the feat seemed utterly impossible. We entered the blacksmith's shed by the door I spoke of, which fronted the high road, and had just finished dressing when we heard a tremendous racket outside. We ran to the door, and there was a little horseman on a night-black nag, galloping furiously in front of the smithy. In a moment the horse was checked, and back came the rider again, sweeping by like the wind. But instead of continuing on the carriage road, the smoking steed dashed over the heaps of rubbish behind the shed, where a horse had never been known to have gone before. Round and round the shed it rushed at a frantic pace, each time faster than before, as if the weird animal had wings. I could see no whip in the rider's hand, or bridle rein, no saddle stirrups or spur, neither could I discern the face of the horseman. The mystic rider then dashed by us so near that the wind it stirred rushed in our faces. On it went in the direction of our home, over the very road we walked. Now, I have omitted to say that the smithy stood in a mineral valley known as Bottom Hill, and its sides were very steep indeed, so that it was a matter of great difficulty to go up them. The carriage road, of which I have previously spoken, wound around its side, running on a considerable length until it reached the top. There was, however, a footpath for passengers almost in a direct line from the lowest part of the valley to the very edge of the hill. At the distance of every few yards there were flights of steps, some of wood and some of stone, so as to mount more easily. But no horse had ever gone up it, as it was like scaling the face of a cliff. Judge of our surprise, then, when this hazardous horseman, but a few feet in advance of us, dashed right up over those steps. As he leapt from level to level and from stone to stone, the black horse seemed standing upright on its hind legs. No sound was heard. No crack of whip, no gee-ho of the horseman, no snort of the jaded beast, but all was still as death. Of course, the wild horse and its wilder rider reached the high road on the top of the valley long before we did. Though we paced on considerably faster than we were wont, Fred was panting with excitement, though we felt no fear. I had hardly expected to see it again, but had resolved that should it make its appearance, to call out boldly and to ask the bold rider his business. Exactly as we reached the last step of the footpath, which would land us upon the main road, there was the black horse and rider coming full tilt in our faces. I had an opportunity for a second to examine the horseman, for by this time the moon had risen and the light was tolerably good. He seemed as black as ink, armless and legless, and no bigger than a farmer's watchdog. He was bent forward upon the horse's neck, so that he was almost double. I could see no face or features of any kind, no whip or bridle or saddle girth. But down he came, sweeping like a storm wave. We shouted, "Good night! Good night!" But there was no reply. nor the slightest recognition of our presence. On went the black horse, galloping into the moonlight, on, on. For several minutes we heard the animal's hooves rattling and ringing upon the road. And then all was silent, and we saw it no more. This has been my nearest approach to seeing a ghost. My nearest approach, I say, for all my moorland training, I dare not believe that it was a spirit. What was it, you will ask? I cannot tell. Sometimes I think it was a monkey escaped, perhaps, from some menagerie, and which had unceremoniously mounted the horse's back, and like Wordsworth's idiot boy, madly roamed about under the stars. But to this day I have caught no clue, nor heard any explanation of the remarkable sight. Well, what a weird story. And I loved that his go-to explanation was an escaped monkey who'd managed to somehow get hold of a horse. Brilliant. It also puts me in mind of, you may remember a number of episodes back when I chatted to Anna Chorlton about Cornish piskies, and I talked about this idea of horses being piskie-ridden. There was this belief that piskies would sometimes get hold of a horse and ride it about to exhaust it overnight, and it was called being piskie-ridden. So some elements of that with this small rider riding on the horse's back and it being a very wild and uncontrollable horse reminded me of that. But it's certainly an interesting one, and it's one of the most out there ones I've found. And I'd be intrigued to hear what your guys' thoughts are on that one. Our next one comes from the Cornubian and Redruth Times, dated the 25th of June, 1925, and it reads, Mr. W. Reynolds, Belmont, Wisconsin, USA, gives the following story in this month's Cornish Arms Bulletin. In a country district not 20 miles from Redruth, one winter, during the dark evenings, several women saw a ghost on the top of the hedge, and a number of women who saw this ghost were badly scared. One evening, a friend of the writer, standing in his stable, observed a dark object moving along the road, but could not hear any footsteps. He said to himself, "Now, this must be the ghost." My friend at once got a pail of water, and when the object was near enough, he had the full benefit of the pail of water. The ghost was heard to say, "Hold on, no more of that, that's quite enough." There was no more ghost seen after his baptism, so this ghost was put to rest with a pail of water. The writer can vouch for the truth of this. I don't know what more you can say about that one, really. It certainly made me chuckle, and it instantly reminded me of a story I encountered in the first edition of Traditions and Hearthside Stories by William Bottrell back in 1870, where he mentions that years back, presumably in the early part of the 19th century, there were rumours locally that a ghost haunted the churchyard at St. Mary's in Penzance. He says, "An open pathway passed through St. Mary's chapel yard, which was then often crossed as it shortened the distance to the quay. But for a long time, few persons liked to pass through the burial ground by night, because a ghostly apparition, arrayed in white, was often seen wandering among the tombs, from which doleful sounds were frequently heard. Sometimes the fearful figure was also met on the path, or seen in the chapel porch. One dark and rainy night, however, a sailor, who neither knew nor cared anything about the ghost of St. Mary's, in taking the short cut through the chapel yard, came as far as the chapel porch, when the ghost issued forth on the path, and there stood, bobbing its head and waving its shroudings before him. "Hullo, who or what are you?" said the sailor.
"I am one of the dead,"
the ghost answered. "If you are one of the dead, then what the deuce do you do here above ground? "Go along down below," said the sailor, as he lifted his fist and dealt the ghost a stunning blow over its head, which laid it sprawling on the stones, where it remained some time, unable to rise or descend, until a person passing by assisted it to get to its legs, and discovered that a frolicsome gentleman called Captain Carthew had long been diverting himself and frightening the townsfolk out of their wits by personating the ghost, which was most effectually laid by Jack Tar and served out for its tricks on the timid and the credulous. I love this story, and I had to share it because it really stuck out to me when I first encountered it. I love this idea that Carthew got it into his head one day to, for whatever reason, start hanging out in the churchyard at night, wearing a sheet to scare the locals. He was probably playing on the idea that the area around Chapel Street nearby was said to be haunted by the ghost of Mrs. Baines. And that's a story it's a longer story that we'll probably look at and delve into a bit deeper at some point. As well as that, there were stories from around that sort of time that one of the old pubs was haunted. We looked into it a little bit in one of the other Piskie Bites, where that old pub, that old building had been torn down, and they discovered this skeleton hidden away, and there were rumours that there'd been this murder. So there were a few rumours of local hauntings, and maybe he was playing on that idea to scare people. Our next article comes from the West Briton, published the 12th of March, 1819, and it reads, Messrs. Ryan and Shepherd of Padstow, having bought from the poor of the neighbourhood all the bones they could collect for the purposes of shipping them for Bristol, a report was circulated that a quantity of human bones was mixed with those collected for sale. This report was confirmed by the alleged appearance of a ghost near the store in which the bones were collected, and which the good folk of the town supposed was that of some individual that wished to prevent its mortal relics from being removed from their native soil and profaned by being put to common use. The alarm was spread, and to prevent the serious interference of the mobility, a sloop was hastily engaged and the bones shipped off without delay, to the no small mortification of those who had determined on opposing such a measure, until they were satisfied that there were none of the mortal remains of their ancestors among them. I first encountered this in Tony Dean and Tony Shaw's Folklore of Cornwall, and then I looked up the original article. It doesn't say what the bones were intended to be used for, perhaps to make bone meal for use in fertilizer and things like that. I can imagine that in a relatively superstitious community at that time, you can imagine there'd be talk of ghosts angry at their bones being dug up and shipped away. And I think, as one of the locals, I'd be pretty angry too if I thought the bones of my ancestors were going to be shipped off to Bristol like that. Next is a short article in the Western Times from the 25th of January, 1834, entitled The Copper House Ghost. A man named Tregenna has been horrorized, great word, by an unusual appearance which he saw. He swears it was a spirit, by Penpole Lower Gate. It had white hair and piercing bright blue eyes, and on his asking it in the name of God what it wanted, it went off, flapping its wings and making a hissing noise. The gate closed of itself against him, and he could not open it. Whether it was an owl or a goose that he saw, the poor fellow was so frightened that he trembled convulsively and continued speechless until a surgeon bled him, when he found his tongue and made the listeners shudder at the tale of terror. Again, I don't know if there's much more to be said about that one. It's certainly another weird one. And you get the sense that the folk at the Western Times aren't perhaps taking it all that seriously. Well, that's it for this little Piskie Bite. Hope you've enjoyed it. We'll be back again very soon with another episode. Thanks for listening.